on this snowy day in Michigan, but at a critical moment in our nation's history as we are in the midst of what has been a struggle, obviously, for many, many decades since the origins of our country, but has now taken on a new sense of urgency, a renewed energy, and has opened a lot of questions about who we are and where we go from here. So this panel is titled After Ferguson. It's a discussion particularly of the legal and moral issues raised by the events in Ferguson as well as in New York and around the country. We know in the wake of the events in Ferguson, names like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Rafael Ramos, Wenjin Liu, and Oscar Grant have become household names. And their deaths have left us questioning both the media portrayal of the proceedings as well as the legal proceedings and their transparency. And here at Wayne Law, we feel we have a responsibility as well to think critically about our role in the midst of these changing times and question what we should be doing as a community, as individuals, as members of the justice system to ensure we continue that legacy of being advocates for justice for all. I think what hits home the most for me and for many of us here is our responsibility as legal agents, not only to move forward, but to look back throughout the years and learn from history and consider how we got to where we are, and again, where we go from here. So today, I'm very pleased to be joined by 6 experts who will discuss the happenings in Ferguson and New York that have triggered the responses I've talked about, and it's really raised almost a global awareness about many of the struggles that have been, in a lot of ways, endured silently for many years. Our panelists bring with them a wealth of information, of experiences and ideas, and I'm really excited. I think this is going to be a great discussion. We'll have time for the panelists to each present various remarks, and then we'll have time for Q&A as well. So do keep your questions written down so that when we come to that time in the program, be interested in the discussion that follows. I want to briefly introduce our panelists and then turn it over to the director of the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights, Professor Peter Hammer. To my right, we have Stephen Henderson, the editor of the Detroit Free Press, Portia Roberson, the head of Detroit's Civil Rights and Justice Division and an alum of Wayne Law. We have our very own Wayne Law professors, Stephen Winter and Blanche Cook, who have been widely cited and regarded as experts in a lot of the legal issues that have been at the center and the core of what's been happening across the country. We have Saul Green of the Detroit Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, as well as our own home icon in the city of Detroit. And we have Wayne Law student and activist Klaus, who was in Ferguson and has personal experiences to share as well as comment on in our discussion. So for now, I want to turn it over to Professor Peter Hammer, the director of the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights. And Professor Hammer needs no introduction, but as many of you know, he is a leading voice in the economic and social issues impacting the city of Detroit today. He's one of our brightest lights here at Wayne Law, and I'm very proud of all the work he's doing at the Key Center and to introduce him now. So, Professor Hammer.
As Judge Keith often reminds me, keep it brief and don't talk like a law professor. So I'll honor the good judge's advice. I want to say good afternoon, everybody here. And I want to welcome you to the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights and this incredibly important program after Ferguson. I want to thank Dean Jocelyn Benson for her kind remarks. I want to acknowledge the role of Saul Nolan, who's sitting over here as assistant director of the center, has played actually doing the hard work putting this together, and the work that Marty and I have done in making sure all the that we don't see behind the scenes. Most of the discussion today will focus on the role of Ferguson and its implication for community and police practices. And that's incredibly important if we're going to make steps in reducing the amount of senseless violence and killing that is taking place. I want to suggest, however, a broader frame in which Ferguson resonates within U.S. Race relations more generally. It's a pattern that really struck me over the break. You got to think more broad. Think not only about police practices, but think about racialized means of social control, and you start to see the broader implications of just police conduct in Ferguson. You have to acknowledge how much the American psyche, historically and today, can ignore and obscure the reality of racial inequity and racial injustice. We don't see it. We're asleep. We slumber. But there's a pattern. One of the opens up our eyes as a country. One of the things that wakes us from our racial slumber is the threat of urban violence. Sadly so. But if you go back to Detroit, 1943, if you go to the rebellions in 1967, the first thing I was thinking out of Ferguson was that echo. And that's what wakes America up. So we have a window now where we're talking much more honestly about race. And my challenge to us collectively and to the panelists, how do we take advantage of that window to have these conversations and make progress on a range of issues before we know what's going to happen? And that window will close again. But I'd love to welcome Stephen Henderson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, who's going to guide us through this great discussion. And thank you all the panelists for sharing your wonderful insights with our audience.
Thank you, Peter. I want to start with just an observation, actually, that I made Monday in a speech at the University of Michigan for Martin Luther King Day. I gave a speech that was about the similarities that we see right now between what is on the big screen and what is on the little screen. I talked about how film, as of late, has been unafraid to portray the most vile and discomforting aspects of our racial history. We're seeing slavery on screen in its most brutal iterations in movies like Django Unchained or 12 Years a Slave. And in Selma, which is in theaters now, we're seeing very stark portrayals of not just the movement, but the response to it. One of the scenes that really moved me was the one that depicted the literacy test. Just a very specific way in which all the questions were ciphers and there was no way to win it. The starkness of those things and the relentless and awful nature of the violence, it's real in a way on the big screen that is conveying a powerful reawakening to the truth. And that's what we're seeing in places like Ferguson, or in Cleveland with Tamir Rice, or in New York with Eric Garner. And I think that parallel between those two realities is really moving. So I was very happy that they asked me to come here today to talk about this and to moderate this panel. We will get started with questions. We'll take questions. I will ask questions for a while, and then we'll take Q&A for the last 15 or 20 minutes. So I want to start here. We are here in Detroit. Detroit is not Ferguson. Detroit is not New York. It's not Cleveland. What is the likelihood that this kind of explosive incident could happen here in a city that has a history of incidents like that and confrontation, but is a long way from it? I'm going to start on my right. Portia Roberson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. About 3 weeks ago, I was watching Meet the Press, and it's interesting to led with this question because I was shocked to find out that Detroit was named as one of the 6 cities that had a racial disparity between the makeup of the city and the police force. And they labeled Detroit, in addition to about 6 other cities, as a place where potentially the next Ferguson could happen. And I was, shocked by that because I'm thinking, we've had blacks in leadership and we've had black police chiefs for so long. I thought maybe the police force was more racially diverse, that it represented or that it mirrored what the city looked like, and that's not true at all. And so I started to think, what is the possibility that this could happen here? And I think, we've had a pretty good history of dealing with police brutality in any form in a way that we act sort of quickly. There's a justice system that seems to have worked here, and I think that is somewhat tempered what could possibly happen here. But I think as with any city, a certain set of circumstances could always make the city explode. And I think often about you look at the Tamir Rice case in particular, and I use that as an example because some of the other cases you get into the dynamics of whether the young men were doing something wrong or whether they should have been in that situation. But this is a 12-year-old kid, and when you watch the video, you see how quickly the police try and order him to do something. Half the time I can't hear what somebody's telling me to do. I can't comprehend it that quickly. You think the police department ran up on a kid and did that. And I think, if that happened here, is there the potential to have it explode? And I certainly think that there is because, we are now asking the police leadership to be very careful of who they put on the police department. And I think, one of the things I've said, one of the things that's bothered me so much in these discussions discussions over the past few weeks is, you know, this idea that you can not talk about bad policing. You can talk about bad lawyers. People do it all the time. So, I don't know why it is that you have to make a decision as to whether you are pro-police or pro-people who've been harmed by police. And so I've said to some of the friends that I have that are on the police department, you know, the first line of defense is really you. You guys, you know, you talk about not snitching, and I had a conversation with a police officer who talked about going out into the community and you know, people will tell you what's going on, and these kind of situations escalate because you're running into a dark scene, you don't know who you're looking for. And I said, you know, I get that, and I understand it. What they do is a job that I would never ask to have, and I'm very thankful that they do it. But I also said, you know what, guys, you all know who bad police officers are very early on. Your responsibility is to tell somebody when you're out doing patrol and you realize that your partner is treating someone inappropriately, to go back to the chief, go back to your command, or go back to your command staff and say, this guy shouldn't be on the street. Until you start to do that and police yourselves, it's impossible that we won't have these situations and we won't question your behavior.
Saul, I want you to jump in here. The work that you've been doing with the Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, I think, is really key in this question. What are you seeing with young African American males in the city, and in terms of the way they see the police here and the way they are policed? And does that give you concern about this kind of incident sort of visiting on a city drug?
I have concerns. I don't know if it necessarily flows from the work of Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, because the fact of the matter is that concentrates more on the violence that's occurring in the community, where unfortunately we're shooting each other, and we're looking at the issues of why there are so many young people as both victims and perpetrators of gun violence. And in that process, what we are trying to do is to make sure that the police are a very integral part of that discussion, and that they are working with young people in ways that are different than perhaps what we've seen that has led to violence in some of these communities. In other words, that there are relationships, that they are in the community, that they are not apart from the community, and that the young people can build some trust. And I think that that has a lot to do with whether or not you've got the elements that ultimately can lead to violence. One of the things that's being discussed a lot among law enforcement now is something called police legitimacy. And what it really says that what has to happen between police departments and the community that they are engaged with is that there has to be a level of trust and interaction that results in people believing that what occurs in any interaction is just and has procedural justice, that they know why they're being stopped, that this is explained to them, that they are given a chance to tell their side of the story, and that the ultimate decision that comes from that encounter is fair. And that when you have that, there's much more greater likelihood that people cooperate. And cooperate in ways that Portia alluded to, not just with regard to that incident, but overall, so that people are more engaged, will get away from this not snitching thing. So whether it's through our work or just generally speaking, there has to be relationships between police and community in order to avoid these kind of issues, this kind of violence that we've seen.
I want to go to our law professors next and have them talk some about the grand jury process, which both in Ferguson and in New York was the sort of center of controversy when grand juries refused to indict officers for killing unarmed black males. I'm wondering, how much faith should we have in the grand jury process? Is the process itself broken, or are these examples of the process breaking down? So,
I think the bigger problem is not the grand jury, it's the prosecutor. There's an idea that the prosecutor who relies on the police day-to-day to make his cases, her cases, is going to be aggressive against a police officer, even when the police officer is hand-off these cases, and statutory cases, and all of these things, I think, are necessary. George talking about moving like that, and I think that would be needed everywhere. Even if we fix that, even if we fix the introduce process, bypass the introduce process, I want to voice a vote of skepticism, because even if you get an indictment, the same thing repeats itself at the trial. The jury, so getting a conviction is just as hard as it's proven to be the indictment in these cases. But it still would be important.
And is it your experience that special prosecutor from the outside sort of cleanses that process of that conflict sufficiently?
That would improve it, whether that's perfected, no, I'd rather not. So, just when we were waiting for the Ferguson grand jury, was that when people, non-lawyer friends would ask us, and they're not going to indict. It doesn't matter what your view of the evidence is. We don't have to see all the evidence in the jury saw. But they're just not going to indict. The prosecutor has no investment in getting an indictment. It turned out in Ferguson that was true to the nth degree. Right? Because he put on the defense case, he just, right? So he didn't act the way prosecutors normally do. It was sort of unfortunate for them.
So I would have asked for a bit of time to unpack the parameters of this question. It's hazardous to always put a litigator on a panel, but I'll try to be brief. One of the first things we learn as law school students is to unpack the embedded presumptions of the question. And if the question is whether we can trust the grand jury process in the Ferguson case, this leads to a broader set of questions. What I want to propose is an alternative framework in which we can look at the Michael Brown Darren Wilson case. And the first step in this alternative framework is to place Michael Brown in a continuum of cases involving unarmed shootings. That continuum would include Trayvon Martin, it would include Ilana Stanley, Renisha McBride, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, and LeVar Jones, just to name a few cases. If we put Michael Brown in that continuum, we begin to see, as Professor Hamer pointed out, similarities and analogies between these cases. I also want to make an argument that these cases are not new. They are not some sort of new phenomenon, but rather perhaps these cases are endemic, if not pandemic. And what is new is our ability to put these cases on the web so that we can draw the analogies and similarities between these cases, and we can engage a critical discourse about these cases. And if we look at the similarities in these cases, if we draw the analogies between these cases, there is an argument that these cases present compelling proof that we have not achieved a post-racial moment, that these cases stand in direct contradiction of any claim that we have achieved post-racialism. And if we delude ourselves into thinking that we have achieved post-racialism in this moment, we will rob ourselves of an opportunity to construct a narrative that names our material reality and that also understands the dynamics involved in these cases. So when we discuss these cases with respect to material reality, how they play themselves out on the ground. There's also the legal discourse involved, the legal proceedings, specifically the grand jury proceeding. And then there's also the public discourse involved in the way in which we discuss these cases, how you and I begin to discuss these cases. There is an arsenal of analytical tools that we can equip ourselves with in order to name this reality. And I don't have the time to go through this whole arsenal, but there's an epistemological lexicon. There are analytical tools we can use to look at these cases. One of them is implicit bias. In short summary, the way racism lodges itself in our subconscious. I urge all of you to go to Project Implicit, which is a Harvard-run website. There is tons of information there with respect to implicit bias. You'll have an opportunity to take the implicit association test. Very quickly, 14 million of these tests have been taken by people all over the country. In addition, there's empirical proof, evidence, and tests with respect to shooter bias and also black as criminal stereotype threat. But in the vast majority of these cases, there is evidence that within our subconscious minds, we make nanosecond determinations about who's violent and who's dangerous, and we place those associations on black and brown bodies, on persons of color. It's very important that we understand how implicit bias works because perhaps it presents an alternative framework in which to look at these cases. Very quickly with respect to the grand jury process in the Michael Brown case, in the Darren Wilson case, there's a couple of things that I want to discuss. Number one, as Saul attests to, at the federal level, 97% of the time that a prosecutor goes to the grand jury, they are successful in getting a true bill or an indictment. 97% of the time. Those figures are comparable within some cases, but the overwhelming majority of the time that any prosecutor goes to the grand jury, they are successful in getting an indictment. In addition, the threshold of evidence necessary in a grand jury proceeding is very low. Probable cause. The grand jury asks whether there's probable cause to believe crimes be committed. The Supreme Courts and other courts have uniformly equipped prosecutors with a tremendous amount of power and discretion with respect to the evidence and the charges that are brought before the grand jury. Very quickly, there's no constitutional requirement that exculpatory evidence is presented to the grand jury. No constitutional requirement that the defendant's defenses are presented to the grand jury. Another unusual set of circumstances with respect to the Darren Wilson-Michael Brown case is that the defendant or the target of the investigation was allowed to testify before the grand jury. There's one other thing that I want to bring to your attention with respect to those grand jury proceedings. I have never seen, and it is highly unusual, for the prosecutors to actually undermine the credibility of their own witnesses in the grand jury proceeding itself. To subject those witnesses to a set of rigorous, robust questions that would undermine their credibility while they are under oath and while that testimony is being reported is problematic for two very quick reasons. Number one, a question remains about the vitality of those witnesses, how useful those witnesses will be in the ongoing federal investigation. It's also problematic with respect to how useful these witnesses will be in any civil action that may be brought in the future. So in sum, what we have is a very highly unusual grand jury proceeding. A couple of really quick points. So not only do we have this unusual grand jury proceeding, but arguably we have no articulated justification for this unusual grand jury proceeding. Bob McCullough, who's the chief prosecutor in Ferguson County, offered two possible justifications for this unusual grand jury proceeding. He stated during the announcement in which he announced the grand jury's decision not to return an indictment, number one, the media, and number two, the witnesses had provided inconsistent statements. We have no idea what that media comment meant, how that would be some sort of justification for this unusual grand jury proceeding. We also don't know what it means that the witnesses had provided inconsistent statements before they testified. The question becomes, if the witnesses had provided inconsistent statements before they went to the grand jury, the question is, why did you go to the grand jury? If you believe you didn't have a case, why are you presenting that case to the grand jury? And there's all sorts of speculation that perhaps you went to the grand jury for political cover. Okay? But with one last point that I just want to clarify. In sum, my answer to this question about whether we can trust the grand jury process in the Michael Brown case, the Darren Wilson case, is what we have is a very unusual set of circumstances in the grand jury process. There has been a lawsuit that has been filed by one of the grand jurors in the Michael Brown, Darren Wilson case. That lawsuit is pending. I just want to bring three issues to your attention, and I promise I'll be quiet after this. But in this lawsuit, Grand Juror Doe, who was one of the grand jurors that participated in the grand jury proceedings, makes three statements. I want to bring those to your attention. Number one, Grand Juror Doe states that the presentation of evidence to the grand jury investigating Wilson differed markedly and in significant ways from how evidence was presented in hundreds of matters presented to the grand jury earlier in its term. The second statement, the investigation of Wilson had a stronger focus on the victim, Brown, than in other cases presented to the grand jury. And then three, explanation of the law was made in a muddled and untimely manner compared with other cases that were presented to the grand jurors. So my answer to this question with respect to trust is to offer you an alternative framework in which to look at this entire
That was very good. Mr. Klaus, I want you to talk some about, you've been in Ferguson a couple of times. Give us an idea of what you're seeing there now. I mean, this is something that we saw on television every day for a time at the end of last year. Seems to have sort of moved back into the background. Is this something that is going to continue? Is there a movement there that's building towards something else, towards some other action, or was it just a moment?
I definitely don't think or hope it was for the moment. I don't think that's what we are seeing, or at least what my Facebook feed is filled with. What I saw there in October was, or felt there really in October, was far different than what I experienced in November. When I was there in October with Henry and Holland and Bilal, who are all here, it was really, I mean, both experiences were moving, but in October, it was a national call for civil disobedience and demonstrations, and people showed up in a really big way. It was really inspiring to see the lengths that people would go to, particularly on that Monday of the national call when it was raining and we were literally pushing the police line back into their own department. That was when Cornell West and other members of the clergy were arrested. It was a beautiful thing. The night before at the convocation was a beautiful thing when the students that are leading this movement with Black Lives Matter took the stage away from the dignitaries that had been invited to say that, you know, you are not out there in the streets. It's us that are out there. And grab the microphone for themselves. That was really inspiring, in part because one of the things that they understand is that, and that they explain to everybody else, is that this isn't just about police brutality. This is about economic justice and violence on a larger scale, systematic violence and systematic oppression. And that it's not just in Ferguson or Detroit or Flint, it's in Palestine, it's in Colombia, it's all over the world, right? So they understand this and explain it well. And so for that reason, I don't think that it's a movement of the moment. In November, it was a little bit different. When we arrived, we had some downtime a few days before the announcement, and we spent that time going to various, I guess what sort of amounts to armed compounds in the Canfield Greens and other areas of Ferguson apartment complex and so forth that are basically turned into communal living places. All the doors are taken off on the inside. They are very organized and very sophisticated, and they have no resources. So what they're able to accomplish is quite amazing, and so the fire that ensued, although extremely heartbreaking, is to be expected, sort of. You know, every time, one of the things I wanted to sort of tie into this global idea of oppression and systematic violence is that, you know, we are all part of this, right? My coat was made in Vietnam, and every time I buy something in Vietnam or we buy some cheap product from China, we are doing violence to our brothers and sisters in Ferguson, in Detroit, and so on and so forth, that then don't have a job, don't have access to education, and then we wonder why there are fires. To get back to your question, I don't see this as a momentary thing. If it's not represented in the media as much, I'm not sure that matters so much, because the media that we're talking about, New York Times, other local media, whatever, they're on their way out. And what young people are listening to now is not so much mass media, but their own media. They have a very good command of Twitter, Facebook, so on and so forth. So for them, this is very real. I should say for us, this is very real, and it's moving forward. And to get back to the question about whether or not this could happen in Detroit, I sure hope it can, and it should, especially in light of the various takings and shifting of burdens in the city of Detroit, where assets like the Detroit water are no longer in the hands of the people; those are being placed in the hands of people that are not elected.
That's right.
And so on and so forth. So I hope that to Detroit. I certainly don't wish for fire on that scale. But if it does happen, we should understand from whence it came. We have a retributivist system, retribution. That's what our justice is based on. So why is it that we're so surprised when we see violence in response to violence?
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to take audience questions after that. What are the responsibilities that lawyers have, and lawyers can have to try to improve the things that went wrong in Ferguson, New York? And what would some of those things be? What would some specific things that they could be working on that would make these things less likely to happen in the future? So,
well, I guess I would agree with the professor in talking about the idea that in cases, especially when you're talking about instances where there are allegations against police officers, that it is automatically removed to perhaps a special prosecutor or the state attorney general. I will say that our Wayne County prosecutor has moved forward with prosecution against police officers in numerous cases, even though it was not popular with various police officers, with obviously the Detroit Police Department or any other law enforcement agency. So I do think she's worked well in doing that. But I think to eliminate the idea of there being a bias, because it is very difficult to work with someone every day to prove your cases and to then turn around and have to prosecute one of them. I remember I started out as a defense attorney doing mostly criminal defense work, and I moved over to the prosecutor's office under the former Wayne County prosecutor, now our current mayor, and I remember I switched on, I finished up with my cases on a Monday, and so I switched over the next day. And the first time I went into the witness box to talk to one of my witnesses on a case, the police officers were in there, and the police officer said to me, "I'm not talking to you." And I was like, "Huh?" And he's like, "I'm not talking to you." And I had to say to him, I'm a prosecutor now. You can talk to me. We're on the same side. Now, you can imagine over the course of years of doing that on either side, the relationships that develop. So had that same officer or any other officer that I worked closely with on narcotics cases and search warrants and all the like been involved in something where I then had to go back and either make a decision to prosecute that person or, in fact, be the prosecutor in a courtroom trying the case, how difficult it might be. So I think that there is, the first thing is maybe looking at how we can make sure that those cases just automatically are removed, so there's no, even when a prosecutor's doing a great job at what she or he's supposed to do, there's no appearance of impropriety or violence.
that's one.
So there's a list of specific legal changes we could talk about. But at the end of the day, once I lay them out, they're all political issues more than they're technical legal issues. The legal fixes are easy, getting them hard. Just let me run through at least four, 3.5. Some years ago, ancient history, when they were talking about revising the federal criminal code in the 1970s, originally known as S1, which was Ted Kennedy's pet project, which was the president. I've worked with John Kiner's subcommittee in the House to redraft the Criminal Civil Rights Division, Section 242, which, without getting into details, basically under a 1940s Supreme Court case, Ferguson versus the United States, it's virtually impossible to prosecute police officers in these kinds of cases successfully. So I drafted the statute, we got it through the committee in the House, and got to the floor, but never went anywhere, the whole statute died in. Nothing's happened since then, right? So there's a specific, that's not the draft, but there's a specific legal change, but you know, how likely is the Republican Congress to go against it? Here's I think a really stunning statistic. It bothers me even more than the grand jury issue in Ferguson. Ferguson, Missouri has a population of 21,135 people. There were 24,532 outstanding arrests.
Oh, wow.
Amazing statistics. This is as of September. Mostly, the vast majority of these are for traffic fines, right, for failure to appear, for failure to pay, etc. So we have this it's worse than the New Jim Crow, right? It's the criminalization of poverty itself, right? And we know from the NPR study we did with the Brennan Center at NYU that this is across the board problem. It's not just in Ferguson, it's lots and lots of different places. Benton County, Washington State, they went up course, and you've got homeless vets who fought in Iraq who are being subjected to the same thing. It's very much about race, but it also at the same time transcends race. So there's an area for legal change. Of course, if you follow the reports on this, in Ferguson, something like over 20% of the municipal budget came from these kinds of activities. So again, about building conflicts. So there's one. Again, the lawyers can write the statutes, yes, the structural changes. But these are all political efforts that have to occur. Dean Chemerinsky at the University of California, Irvine Law School put an op-ed piece in the New York Times back in the fall, and he blamed the Supreme Court. He's absolutely right. Supreme Court, since a case that I argued in the 1980s, when the court struck down the fleeing felon doctrine, the Supreme Court has sided quite flawlessly with the police. So police can drive at 100 miles an hour, ram your car off the road, right? Chase you at 80 miles an hour, and then when you finally stop, cripple the car with bullets, just fine. So here's an argument, and that's before we talk about things like community defenses in 1980 civil rights actions. So here's another one. We could, at the state level, make state causes of action that dealt with these kinds of police behaviors without the specific limitations that apply in the federal cause of action. Of course, once again, how do we get that through the Republican legislature in Michigan? So there are specific legal reforms that are going to require political will. Last is the half. Right? There's this fundamental problem of the militarization of the police. By that I mean not just the obvious pictures when they've got too much military gear from the Iraq War era, though that's part of the problem. But this sense of themselves as an occupying force who has authority and is sort of separate and above the law. This is an endemic problem. It's worse in some places than others. It's clearly worse in New York City, as those who've been watching the reaction of the police union. And all the mayor had to do was tell his part African-American son, be careful of the police, and they were indicting him as entities, but the father wouldn't tell him his or her child.
That's right.
So these are fundamental problems. There are technical things that lawyers can do, but ultimately it's not going to be lawyers.
So, very quickly, I want to draw a distinction between the social media and the mass media. The social media has given all of us a tremendous amount of agency that is transformative. And what do I mean by that? Within the social media, we have an opportunity to lend our voices with respect to this discussion. Your cell phones equip you with an opportunity to record exactly what is going on the ground in material reality. Your Facebook accounts, your Twitter accounts, as been suggested, your blogospheres are places in which you can engage the critical discourse surrounding these cases. Coming to panels of this kind will equip us all with additional information so that we can lend our voices to the discourse surrounding these cases. Finally, I want to chime in and say there is an argument for special prosecutors and special investigators. As already been stated, it is very difficult to avoid the conflict of interest inherent in a situation in which you have prosecutors investigating and prosecuting people that they work with on a day-to-day basis. also a compelling argument that we should have implicit bias training throughout the ranks of law enforcement. That would include local law enforcement, federal agents, state prosecutors, as well as federal prosecutors.
Thank you. That's all.
One of the most important things is the willingness to represent those that are victims of and subject to the kinds of police actions that we're discussing today, just as in the lawsuit that's now being brought by the grand juror to challenge the grand jury proceeding. You need adept, courageous lawyers to make those arguments and to present those cases to the court. A particular instance that I had some participation in was with regard to Cincinnati, Ohio, which was went through a process of police reform in the early 2000s based on racial profiling, but also the shootings of 14 African-American black men killings between 1995 and 2001. Lawyers in Cincinnati were able to convince the court to establish a class that was made up of African-American citizens and African-Americans who traversed through Cincinnati to challenge the actions and activities of the Cincinnati Police Department. That resulted in significant reforms as it relates to both training and accountability. And that is so important because I agree completely with what Blanche says with regard to implicit bias, but I think there's going to, the process of changing the way we currently think is going to take a while. This has been the result of centuries of this method of dealing with communities of color. So part of it has to be to make police conduct themselves, make the police in different ways, train in different ways, and impose different forms of accountability on them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer yet, so I'm not going to speak as one. But, I mean, in terms of making changes to the legal system, I think it's got to be a wholesale change. Let's not forget that, let me back up. I heard an interesting discussion on this the other day by a friend and comrade at the ACLU who was talking about the fact that the system is not designed for equality. And so we have to get rid of this notion that, you know, we just need to make a few minor recalibrations or a few, you know, if we just get this one statute right, you know, it's going to fix whatever. If we can just get one more person on the Supreme Court. No! At one point in this country, when we were drafting our system, some people were actually property, and property is how we define our rights. So now we got a bunch of people without property, and they're supposed to exist within that system, and I don't think the math works out, but, you know, hey, I don't do math, that's fine. But, so I think we need to start thinking about something other than just, you know, if we can just get the right decision or something like that, especially in light of Citizens United, which to me is just, that's one of the worst offenders. I mean, as we talk about making changes, let's not forget what the Supreme Court just did to the Voting Rights Act too, right? I mean, so are things getting better? Do we need just a few minor adjustments? It doesn't seem to me like that's really going to have much effect in light of, you know, deliberate indifference and things like that.
Okay. Before we take some audience questions now, Paula has the mic. Just raise your hand. We'll make sure you. This is supposed to end at 1:15, right? We're at 1:08, so again, keep brevity in mind.
To address the first question about the likelihood of something occurring in Detroit, I think it's more likely here than anywhere else because, you know, here you have a marginalized, incarcerated community of color. You have a Latino community attacked by immigration, unreasonable immigration laws. You have an Arab Muslim population, the most highly concentrated outside of the Middle East. attacked on so many different levels. You know, I am a third-year law student, and I'm on the terrorist watch list. So I think that the likelihood is definitely more so than anywhere else. And also, I appreciate the framework in which you described, Professor Cook, but I'd also like to expand this framework to include slavery and colonization and world domination. And this is the context that we should all be thinking about when addressing these issues.
Okay, here you go. I don't know if Professor Hamburg is here anymore, but he made the comment that we speak more honestly on race. I can't believe that, you know, because we all have our differences and we keep them within. It's just like in Grosse Pointe, which is close to us, and we talk about the guy who got kicked, and the news media is saying, well, it's alleged that he had police brutality. Why don't they let that little prompter come through and said the victim alleged he was kicked and then show the film?
So, I'm taking a little point of privilege here since Grosse Pointe came up. Some of you may have read, about 7 months ago, I was at a Talbot's, and Stephen Henderson has asked me many times why I was at Talbot's, but I was, and I don't expect any judgment for that. I was profiled, for lack of a better way of saying it. I was shopping, I had come to return some items, I had a shopping bag and a purse, and I walked into the store and I was told, I was asked, could I be helped? And I said, well, I want to look around a little bit, but I do have some items I'd like to return. The saleswoman helped me. She put some stuff in the fitting room. I went in, tried it on, came back out, picked up another item, as women and men do. We want to match things up and figure out what works, what doesn't work. Went back into the fitting room, came back out the second time, and then Grosse Pointe Park police were there. And they asked me, could they look at my bag? And I you know, at the time, you know, it takes some distance to know whether or not, you know, to see it as a positive experience. I'll say this, that looking back now, I think my reaction to it and the feelings I've had since then have been so enlightening in terms of what is going on in this country, because I can only say to you all, I graduated from Wayne State Law School in 1993. I've been a lawyer a little over 20 years now, and at the moment that the police approached me, every bit of law school training and out of the window. Voice shaking. You know, the first thought that came to my mind was maybe something happened to my parents or my family members and they're coming to tell me, but that makes no sense whatsoever because I don't live in Grosse Pointe, so why would they send Grosse Pointe Park police to tell me? I couldn't think of, like, why would you want to search my bag? Why do you look in it? So I handed the bag over and I, you know, let them look in it. And, you know, sometime afterwards I thought about a couple things. One, again, how it must feel to be stopped. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I knew I didn't have anything in the bag that I hadn't paid for. I was perfectly well within my right. I was dressed in capri pants and a matching boat shirt and a little hat, so it was like my look was, you know, it's, you know, people talk about hoodies and walking around the neighborhood in a hoodie at night. Didn't have any of that on, and felt an extreme sense of humiliation, and could only think that I won't share with you my age. I'm sure you can figure it out. But if you're a 17-year-old kid and you've probably done some things that we've all done, if you're unsure, am I being stopped because I did something last week that I shouldn't have done, or I smoked some weed that I wasn't supposed to smoke, and so you're already nervous because you may have done something they could be asking you about, but you haven't done anything that's really illegal or that you really should be having this confrontation with the police. The feelings that I felt gave me such an insight into so much more of how someone would feel if they were confronted in the dark or on a road by themselves or without a law school education, without a number of years between me and that law school education where I practiced law. You know, and so when it finally came out using social media, you know, it was great. They said DOJ appointee and now currently Director of Civil Rights and Ethics at the City of Detroit. But it helped me the insight. And so I say all of this just to say that when you talk about implicit bias, when you talk about sort of the idea that people approach you, you know, here I was, and I've never been somebody who said it couldn't happen to me. But when it did happen to me, it was so eye-opening that despite whatever accolades, education, job you have, it was humiliating, and it was enlightening in terms of the fact that I can only imagine what a number of men and women have felt when they are either seeking help, if they were Nisha McBride, or confronted by police and stopped, and not knowing what to do, and thinking how differently that situation could have gone even for me.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah.
So the professor said, believes that the system needs a total overhaul. As a young African American man, my question of all of you guys is, number one, do you believe that the system can be overhauled in the foreseeable future? And number two, if not, what do you think that we as people, and more specifically African Americans, do to operate better so that people aren't leaving their household, hearing their lives, parents wondering if their sons are going to be able to come home because they don't know how to operate or stop by the police and things like that?
I'll let anybody who wants to take that.
I'll speak to it a little bit.
That's a tough question.
I mean, I'm not going to tell you what I think African American people should do, for change necessarily. But my belief, my personal belief, is that radical change is needed. And in order to get radical change, you've got to do something radical.
That's
and
right.
The only way in my view, to attack the system is to attack what matters to the people in charge of the status quo most, which is wealth, right? They're interested in material, mineral wealth, and so on and so forth. So you've got to disrupt the system somehow. Whether that means acts of civil disobedience, boycotts, whatever, that seems to me to be the script. I don't know that the old methods, or I shouldn't say the old methods, but the methods of the 60s and 70s will work the same. But I think we have the intelligence to figure out a way to do it right. Maybe not today, but sometime.
But I also just mentioned, I'm pessimistic. I can remember as a young man, particularly growing up in the civil rights era, and looking at all of the protests and the pain and the violence that was inflicted on Black people, that, through legislation and through change and through interaction, the things were going to smooth out. I kept thinking, when I got to this age, we're going to be living in a much more, better environment and living together and not so separate. I mean, the fact of the matter is we remain as segregated now, we may be more segregated than we were back in the 1960s. So I won't see it, I know that. And I do think that there's disruption, because what happened in the 1960s was a form of disruption and a form of bringing attention to the horrible inequities and doing it in a way that I think caught the public attention. But I also think that we do also have to do some of the simple practical things. I mean, I think we are stuck in this system for now. We have to go and vote. And we have to try to change the leadership. We have to be able to at least let those who are currently making the decisions that affect us as it relates to policing and other issues, that they reflect us, they reflect our views. I think it was important that Blanche was an assistant U.S. attorney. I believe that anybody who had her to touch a case that came into that office got justice. I believe we have to also be participatory.
This may sound like an old-fashioned and silly, but register and vote. We're in a very highly polarized system. And just solve the problem. Because you got to register and vote, and you're going to have to fight to stop the gerrymandering of districts. Republicans win most of the congressional seats, even though they don't have federal registered Democrats and there are Republicans. So there's a lot of work to do. But just make excuse for not voting. And it matters. It matters. There are many places in the South that look like they vote now, simply the fact that the black politicians know that they have to get black votes in order to be elected. So this I think, is critical. I think we have to tell our stories too, just so. I think that's the word. So yeah, you should write it down. My joke is I feel bad for the Grosse Pointe Park police. I live there because there are so many African American doctors and lawyers who live there now. They don't know who to stop.
And I'm sad though that they were actually very respectful to me. It wasn't the police that ultimately was the issue, but it was from my end, it was the idea that, you kind of walk around with this like visor on that says like, okay, I've passed the point where this is probably going to happen to me, and I'm in a store in Grosse Pointe, and it's unlikely. And you kind of look at the person who walks in next to you, and they're asking somebody the questions, and you're thinking, why are they asking that person that question? But you never stop. And it's interesting is that on social media, because I read too many of the stories and too many of the comments. It really, even for me, it was very strange. I knew it had happened. I knew it had happened to me. I was there. But there was a woman who was at the counter at the same time. I'm assuming she was a white woman who was shopping at the same time because I was the only one in the store, so I'm going to make that assumption. And she put on social media, she put on one of the pages that she was there when it happened, and she had a bag as well, and she said it was humiliating for that young lady. She didn't know me, I didn't know her. And it was interesting because she hadn't said anything while it was happening, but I'm guilty of that as well. So I get it, but it was a moment where I thought, wow, she saw that it was humiliating to me. I knew it was humiliating to me, but she didn't say anything because we also get in our bubbles and don't speak out when we see sort of these injustices happening. We're busy with our day. And so I would just add that when you're out there, you talk about what can be done differently, we get involved. I mean, on every level. When you see it happening, when you see a police car pulling over some kids and they got them all out, and they got them up against the back of the car, slow down for a minute. You got a minute to take some time to find out exactly how you're going to treat them during that arrest. Don't get involved in it. Don't interfere with the arrest. But just watch to make sure, because now that social media is so popular out of Facebook and your camera phone, your video, they're a lot more conscious when they realize that people are watching them. And then, just to take back what the president said, not only voting in the presidential elections, but I was in the local elections, there's so much more about how you live your daily lives. So don't just vote when hope and change is happening. Vote in that, school board election. One you're like, what? Well, I'm with kids. Why am I voting in a school board election? Yeah, you know what? Because it matters. And the mayoral races and the congressional races and the state rep races are really more about how it affects your daily life.